Here we are, everybody, on August 9th, 2022 at Stochastic Agency, the second week of RPG a Day. Today, we're going to talk about what is the second RPG you bought. Without a doubt, after playing D&D for a while, it's no secret that for most people that know me, my favorite genre is fantasy. So it was a pretty easy jump to go from playing D&D to playing Warhammer Fantasy. Now, this was way back when we had the first edition. It was a soft cover book that I purchased because at that time, Warhammer came all as one book. It's pretty fat compared to like most big RPG games you buy these days. If you look at anything from Odysseus, like Star Trek Adventures or Conan, or even if you look at the current edition of Warhammer, that was about the size of the book back then. The system was different. It was also a system that was adapted to play or easily blend into or carry over the characters for a tabletop war game, which is kind of the way I went for a while. I was drawn to the game because it was definitely very different than D&D. Even though Dungeons and Dragons had a very well-defined setting in Greyhawk at the time, or Blackmoor, the Warhammer universe was very different. It made more sense when you looked at things like alignment, that you were aligned with these various different entities and powers in the world. There was a reason to say that your character had a lawful or law-based alignment, or you were a neutral-based alignment, or a chaos-based alignment. And that was all you had, was the three. It was a much darker, grittier game. It was just as deadly to play. It had a different advancement structure than D&D had. You had careers and not levels. Although within a career, you could advance things as you were going along. So even though there wasn't a level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of setup, there was this inner profession advancement. You would gain abilities, increase stats, and that was one of the things that made it very different from D&D, is that your character, when you made them, you didn't just have whatever you rolled when you first started. There were certain things that you would get if you moved from, say, the bounty hunter profession into the ranger's profession, or vice versa, or you moved from the thug profession into the thief's profession or assassin's profession. There were different things that would advance. It definitely made use of a variety of dice. It was percentile based for the most part, or in some respects D10, in some respects D6. So you got to use a little bit more variety of dice. The primary skills used within the game were all percentiles, either based off of, like, say, an agility, or your weapon skill, or your ballistic skill, or anything like that. Whereas some stats had, a 100% representation. Other stats were just based off of a D10. So it made the translation from a player character in the role-playing game into the same kind of template when you transfer it over to playing the tabletop war game. So the hero in your units could have been your character. You could simply translate it very easily into Warhammer. Dark, gritty, magic was very different. And I know, fantasy and magic has its fans, and it has its place in RPG history, as it does with so many people. But it was different. It was a little bit more interesting. It was a little bit more interesting because there weren't a lot of just automatic things that happened. You still had to cast a spell. So there were a lot of times where, when you're going along and you're involved in an encounter, you're just not going to be able to cast a spell because you failed. There were more interesting bents on the lore. Granted, Warhammer Fantasy is more or less an analogy for Europe in many respects, and there was definitely some great work done on developing the different cultural representations within the regions of Warhammer It's got some great maps. It's got really great splat books for just lore. Not a lot of stuff was really developed as far as alternate classes and things like that, or alternate careers or professions. But there was a huge wealth of material available to someone who was playing Warhammer. Even when it wasn't online, they had their own magazine too. Eventually, White Dwarf came along. It was the answer to Dragon magazine at the time, but it was more Warhammer based, more tabletop strategy, war game based, and definitely had some great articles in it. I remember having read it once I got into Warhammer, much older when I got into that versus playing D&D. And I want to say that was probably the second game that I actually ran. I was just out of high school I think I was my senior year in high school is when I remember running that. I picked it up, I think the year before at the hobby store. Nobody wanted to play it, of course. Every time you try to introduce a new game, nobody wants to play it. But I did manage to find another group later on. I think it was just junior and sophomore. So I remember being on the track team, and that was my junior and sophomore year in high school. And I continued playing Warhammer for quite a while. Once I got into the tabletop strategy game, I kind of went back to playing a little bit more D&D, and then playing the Warhammer Fantasy Battles on the outside of that. Eventually got weaned off of that financially, thankfully. But as the second game that I ever bought, I was extremely happy with the purchase. I still love the game to this day. I love pretty much all the iterations that have come out for Warhammer Fantasy, and the wealth of material that's available for it is just fantastic. So, wrapping up, August 9th, what is the second RPG you bought? Warhammer Fantasy Role Playing. Great game, great setting. Get out there, play more games, try something new, introduce somebody else to a game, and above all, have a good time, be great with each other.